forgot.
Okay, because I'm going to only do some of the slides. We have plenty.
Test, 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 test. Test, test. Test, test. Okay, okay. So are you hearing? You hearing me? Are you hearing me now? No.
What about switching it off and trying?
Or the old-fashioned way? Or the old-fashioned way?
I was trying to get a coffee, but they had stopped in the Australian, and the other place the line was too long.
I will.
This one works. And then, um, how can I solve this? How can I solve this? Let me think.
Is there a problem with all
5295.
of them?
Sorry?
Is there a problem with all of them?
There's a problem with all of them. It's because I've had no opportunity
To
to
recharge.
recharge any of the batteries because we've just been back to back to back to back to back. So, apart from the fact that the headsets have all just died because they've been back to back to back to back all day with no recharge time. Apart from that, all's fine.
Is it possible for the mic to work?
The mics work, you just can't hear that they're working.
Charging at the moment?
Sorry?
You're not going to get them on the charge now?
Well, we're just about to go into the very last session. So,
Okay, I'll leave it to you.
yeah, no, I'll. All of the sessions are just overrun and overrun all day. This is unfortunately the reality that the vast majority of them are all flat. Yeah, no, absolutely. The mics are working. Okay, everybody in the outside world is hearing. Zoom is hearing, YouTube is hearing, we're not, and it's just because all of the batteries in these have gone flat, where we've just been solidly at it since 10 o'clock this morning, and I've had no chance to recharge them.
Or from another station?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way, I'm afraid.
If we close the door, can we just use the mic?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Apparently we've been using these for the entire day, so the batteries are good. So we're not going to use the headsets. Okay. So
But when you're, it will seem very, very odd and very strange, but when you're talking into a mic, it is still going out on the live streams.
Okay, all right. So we're talking to the stream.
You're talking to the stream.
Okay, all right, no problem.
we have to start
And
the
the people, okay,
projection
so we're
of
just
us
doing live.
together.
Sorry?
Then we have to project in of us together.
Yes.
So can we start?
Yeah. Please do.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I know it's been a long day, and if you're like us, you've been in a lot of events. Your capacity to absorb is probably at its maximum, but I'm going to ask you to just give us your attention because we have an exciting proposition that we would like to share. Last week, CDB introduced our recovery duration adjuster, and we are pleased to reiterate our proposition. So without saying too much more, I will show you a short video that gives an overview of this new tool and what we feel it can accomplish. And then after that, Dr. Jean Leon, the president of the CDB, will give you a presentation which will go more in depth into our proposal. So thank you very much for your attention, and without further ado, I present the recovery duration adjuster.
The Caribbean is a region rich with vibrant cultures, people, and scenery. But as mostly small island developing states, we face unique economic, social, and environmental challenges. Our geographic locations, as well as social, economic, and environmental conditions, leave us vulnerable to external shocks, whether they're financial, trade, health, or even climate-related. In cases where developed countries face similar events, their ability to recover while still preserving the welfare of their citizens differs vastly. The fact that it takes a Caribbean country 3 times longer to recover from a natural hazard than a developed nation underscores the need for an upgraded measure of vulnerability for small island states in the region. For 40 years, while the region has been battered by natural hazards, we have continued to use the same vulnerability indices as larger or more developed countries. These indices have been based predominantly on gross national income, or GNI, per capita as a measure of economic development. The problem is that GNI fails to take into account the underlying structural weaknesses of small states, such as small market size, narrow range of exports, high debt, aging infrastructure, and outmoded public institutions. Under these conditions, it takes longer for a shock to dissipate, and recovery costs are much higher than in developed countries that experience similar events. The U.S. state of Florida and the Caribbean island Dominica are both equally susceptible to a Category 5 hurricane. But it takes longer for Dominica to recover from that hurricane. The recovery duration would depend on the magnitude and severity of the impact, as well as the initial economic and social conditions. The longer lag in the recovery period for small developing states highlights the importance of having a measurement system that includes the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of development. So, how can we achieve this? Well, through the Caribbean Development Bank's Recovery Duration Adjuster. a dynamic and forward-looking vulnerability and resilience framework, the Recovery Duration Adjuster captures the adverse effects of the resilience drag and more accurately reflects the status of development in small states. This affords policymakers greater insight into how tomorrow's vulnerability can be addressed in today's decision-making. The ultimate aim is to shorten the total recovery time for SIDS. Quicker recovery leads to a more stable standard of living for citizens. CDB's Recovery Duration Adjuster is a more comprehensive measure of the economic, social, and environmental reality of small island states. Now, the RDA provides a more relevant per capita income adjusted measure, facilitates a better evaluation of the impact of shocks on small states, and can provide a firmer basis for justifying the mobilization of much needed financial resources. As we grapple with the social and economic fallout from COVID-19 while facing the constant threat of climate hazards and acts of nature, small states need a vulnerability and resilience measurement system that considers all the factors impacting the welfare of their citizens. CDB will continue to develop its Recovery Duration Adjuster and will collaborate with regional and international institutions to refine our methodology. The road to rescue, recovery, and resilience starts here. Let's work together to build better, stronger, more resilient Caribbean economies.
Thank you very much. And now I present President Jean Leon, and he will give the full overview and the details of the RDA. President?
Yeah. Very good. Can you hear me? Okay. So what I want to do is give you a, let's say, focused view version of this. I'm one, mindful of the time, but two, I want you to go straight in and see what it is that we are going to do. So I will not go through the slides. We'll just zero in on where we need to be at whatever point in time. So to understand what this is doing, let's put where we are in a little bit of context. At the moment, the countries in the region are effectively in what we call the perfect storm situation. And it's a perfect storm because they have three related and interrelated problems. The first is there's a legacy problem. And the legacy problem is where the countries were before the pandemic. And that's all your structural weaknesses, your implementation deficit, your high debt, and what we can say, your weak infrastructure. Okay, all the things that have made it difficult for us to so all the things that have made it difficult for us to pull out of, and a problem when we face it, are still there. The second part of the problem, so I call this legacy or yesterday's problem. The second part of it is really today's problem. Today's problem is the pandemic, in the sense that what the pandemic did coming as a shock is it has actually generated a multiplicity of issues. And that multiplicity of issues spans both the economic, it spans the social, it spans the external, and what we have is the layering of yesterday's problems on today's problems. The third part of the issue is what I'm calling tomorrow's problem. And tomorrow's problem is why we are here today, the climate issues that are not yet here in full, but we know where they are going and we know how they are going to get there. And the three things are linked in the sense that the problems we have not yet solved, plus the new problems we have inherited through the pandemic, and the new problems we're about to receive are linked and are interrelated. And so if you're going to solve where you are today, you have to be able to understand how all of those three things are linked. And it doesn't make any sense talking about I can solve yesterday's problem or solve today's problem or solve tomorrow's problem without ensuring that you take a look at all three. And so it's a complex problem because not only is it spanning yesterday and tomorrow, but the bigger part that makes it complex is governments are now tackling the problem as if all they need to focus on today is the pandemic. And they will throw everything they have at the pandemic. But by the time tomorrow comes and you have the climate problem, if the solution you put into today's problem is not consistent with where you should be for tomorrow's problem, then you just shift the problem from one to the other. And you're not really solving your problem. So you have to be able to see how the three things are connected. The second thing that makes it complex is we have what we are calling vulnerabilities in our space. And those vulnerabilities that we have repeat. They don't happen once and stop, whether it is trade shocks from outside, global financial crisis, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, they repeat. And because they repeat, if you end up ignoring that particular element, as you design policies for thinking about today and policies for thinking about tomorrow, then you will again miss a very significant part of your problem. And one way of thinking about this is, we say when you first take debt to invest and your economy is growing, and then the hurricane comes and the hurricane wipes out all of your infrastructure, as it did in a Dominica or a BVI at that particular point, the debt that you took to build before the hurricane is not wiped away. It's still there. But it's not that it is only still there. You have to borrow new to actually allow you to rebuild. And God forbid if another one comes back the following 2-3 years later, it wipes away again what you just put in. But now you'll have two amounts of debt to repay and maybe a third to borrow to bring you back again to where you are. And so that complex of issues that we face, we think one calls for a holistic situation that recognizes the three elements that make up what constitutes how we operate in the world. The first is, and you'll all understand that well, the short-term stability framework that an institution like the IMF puts on you, which is your debt sustainability framework, which effectively says, can you continue to service your debt? Are you solvent? Or do you have a liquidity problem that needs to be addressed? The second is the longer-term investment growth problem that the World Bank's framework handles, that now tries to take you from where you are to a stage of development. And the third is what the UN is now concerned about, which we are calling loosely a resilience framework, where you want to take account of your SDGs, but you also want to build it with resilience, especially with regard to climate. And so we need to find a way of marrying those three concepts. And when we marry them together, what I think we end up with is a vulnerability resilience framework that spans time and allows us the ability to be able to see how our problem of yesterday, today, and tomorrow can be viewed in a holistic frame. And when you do that, you realize that there are three parts to the solution. The first part is, how do you rescue when you are in a disaster mode? The second is, once you move out of rescue, you need to move into recovery. And everybody understands that well. A hurricane goes by. Your first line is, how do you get water to people? How do you put them in shelters? The second is, you start with the cleanup. And the cleanup now begins to allow you to grow, but you are really not yet putting yourself into your longer term trajectory. And that longer term trajectory is your repositioning. And your repositioning in that sense now says, how do you transform your economies from where it is post the disaster to a better place with potential that can allow you to grow? So that is what we start off with, in that we say, whenever you have disasters that occur, shocks that occur, you need to have a three-phase approach to examining that problem: a rescue, a recovery, and a repositioning. But it is equally faulty to say that the policies you are going to use across the three phases should be the same. In fact, it cannot be the same. So we need separate policies for rescue, distinctly different policies for recovery, and a third set of policies for repositioning. But what you will realize is all the policies we are talking about require one particular element, and that is finance. Without money, you cannot do anything. So therefore, what you need is financing tools and instruments for rescue, financing tools for recovery, and financing tools for longer-term repositioning. And those tools, in a sense, already exist, but they are not necessarily applied in that particular form. So when we talk of rescue financing, you're now talking short-term emergency, short-term liquidity support, short-term funding that are simply assistance money. Like we did in the case of the global financial crisis, we did in the case of the pandemic, but these are short-term funds, and they come with different conditions. They may be grants, they may be aid, they are not your typical loans. Now you have short-term recovery, which effectively is to rebalance, to take you out of where you have fallen to the beginnings of where you want to go. And that now requires things like what we at the bank use, like policy-based loans. Or it might be some 3-5-year loan program, which will take you part of the way, but not exactly where you want to be. And the terms of that will equally be different. You'll be monitoring it in a different form. But when you move to the third phase of repositioning, at that time, what you really want is financing for longer-term finance, where the measurement might take a longer time before you can actually start to see the benefits of that particular line. And so the terms of that financing ought to be different. The problem we face is the international architecture, as is now, does not allow for that differentiation. And even when it is longer term, it does not provide you with the means to benefit from the problems that you face. And the problem we face in small islands is one of resilience. And let me explain that before I go on. When we say resilience, we have to understand resilience as what will provide you with sustained development. And keep the word sustained development in mind. If I am flying, sustained means I can keep at one level. If I start to drop and I sink, I no longer can say I'm sustained. So therefore, anytime I begin to drop, if I don't have the ability to come back up, I really cannot talk about remaining on a sustained level, let alone continuing to grow. So if you're going to be resilient, you must have the ability to recover and recover from any shock that actually hits you. The problem is that when a shock hits you, the shock does not address one slice of you. The shock addresses the whole of you. So in the case of the pandemic, for example, you had an economic shock. People lost jobs, unemployment rose, poverty increased, education got hit, people couldn't go to school, health systems crashed, mental problems arose, gender-based violence increased. All of this is happening at one point in time because of that shock. So therefore, if you are going to talk about resilience as recovering, then recovering cannot be about one part, which is just, did I get my job back? Or did my GDP grow back? It has to be the totality of everything that went south. And therefore, recovery has to be seen, just as development ought to be seen, as a holistic concept. So, because it is a holistic concept, when you say resilience, it must be resilience across a number of dimensions. And so we have chopped this down into saying there are 5 dimensions that make up the whole. The first is social resilience, which talks about people, whether it's health, education, cultural mindset, how they see life, the social part. There is institutional resilience, which, as you know, in the region, we all have this problem of people cannot implement, or they start, don't stop, or they don't have capacity. They need to build capacity. So resilience means the same way when a shock occurs, institutions go south. How do you rebuild institutions? The third is your productive capacity resilience. That one is easy to understand. In the same way that your capital is crushed, whether it's your schools, your roads, your bridges, and therefore your economy cannot recover, we have to be concerned about how do we rebuild those capital elements to be able to now allow capital to be transformative to get capital into output. The fourth is what we can call environmental resilience. And environmental resilience is quite clear. That's what everybody is talking about. Climate, that's one of the things we want to talk about, and how resilient can we be? And we talk now about the Build Back Better movement, or the Build Forward Better movement. And the fifth element of resilience, which underlies all of that, is financial resilience. Because without the ability to access finance, without the ability to borrow, you clearly cannot pull yourself out, no matter how well-intentioned you are. So we need to be able to tackle all 5 of those, not necessarily all at the same pace, but for sure all need to be in our framework as we tackle the idea of rebuilding to be able to maintain sustained development. So where does that enter the picture that we are trying to establish? It enters the picture we are trying to establish because in the broader scheme of things, what the world tells us is we are too rich to get help. And so they base that on simply the idea of GNI. Your GNI is 10,000 per capita. Therefore, you don't need help because there are so many more countries that are poorer than you. And so the only way you can access finance here is if your GNI is small. But because it is large or too large, we cannot give you any help. So we start from that perspective and say, for the last 30, 35 years, we've been struggling. Every time we say to the international community, GNI is inadequate, they say, yes, it's inadequate, yes, it's inadequate, but that's as far as it goes. So we wanted to come up with an idea that we could say is A, robust, B, universally applicable, that will show that GNI can be replaced, and replaced in a way that will magnify or make very clear the peculiarities that we have as small states. And that is how we came up with our recovery duration adjuster. Now, the idea, which is fairly simple, and I will tell it to you and come back and explain it, is that what if we can establish a value to recovery? If we can put a value to recovery, then what we can say is, I may very well be starting at 10,000, but after the event occurs and I no longer can claim I have 10,000, then it would be totally unfair to tell me that my access to finance has to be based on 10,000 when I no longer have 10,000. But how can I say I no longer have 10,000? If it is the case that I get hit and I crash and I recover within a year, that is temporary. So for all intents and purposes, my 10,000 stays exactly as is. But if it is the case that after I get hit, I fall, and I stay at that level for a long time, then it cannot be the case that I am in the doldrums for years and I am still being earmarked as though I was at 10,000. But you have to be able to quantify that, and quantify it in a way that you could say is really very, very clear and applicable to everybody. And so I start off with an example to be able to illustrate this. I say before I tell you how it is, you have to distinguish the three parts of an event. The first part of an event is, what is your susceptibility to an event? And that is typically where we are when we talk of vulnerability. You are subject to, may be impacted by something, so you are vulnerable. Beyond that stage, when the event occurs, hurricane, non-hurricane, you no longer are in the realm of probability. The event has occurred, and at that time, it has an impact. Once we get past the impact, depending on how deep you fall, the question is, how quickly can you get back to where you were before the event occurs? And the sad truth is, in the region, it takes us 3 to 4 times longer than a developed country would in terms of recovery. And the example, which is where I was talking a little while ago, to illustrate that is, Maria is coming through the Caribbean. Okay, Hurricane Maria. The probability of it hitting Dominica and going on to hit Florida in the same year are the same, right? In fact, we know once it starts across the Atlantic, it's going to hit somewhere. So the vulnerability is in fact identical. But when Maria hits, if it hits Dominica, what we do know is, as happened, it crashes Dominica 200% of GDP. That same storm, if it had gone straight and hit Florida, would wipe out Florida, but it's only going to wipe out not 200% of GDP of the US, but 1% of GDP of the US. Because the remaining, however many states, 50 states, are alive and well. And the ability to recover, fix Florida, maybe 1 year, whereas Dominica may be 10 years before Dominica can get back to where it was before Maria hit. So if you focus on vulnerability as a probability vulnerability aspect, you are missing out the most important part, which is your resilience, your ability to recover. And so what we have is this chart here that shows you, in essence, what we are trying to measure. If I am ordinarily a country like a Dominica, and I am on this trajectory up to 2017, if nothing had happened, I have a vulnerability, but nothing happens, I would continue to grow along this blue chart. So that defines growth. The vulnerability occurs right here. If I am a long, low resilience country, which means it will take longer for me to recover, my recovery to get back to this point by 2020 is now going to take me all the way to 2028 before I can get there. If I have high resilience, like a Florida, I'm going now to go down a little, and even if I had fall as much, but my recovery is going to be that much more. To get to that same level, I get there in 2023. So this difference between where you would be if you had ordinarily traveled and how much longer it takes you to get to the same level post the event is what we are calling your resilience drag, or conversely, your internal resilience capacity. So it says, how long will it take you under your circumstances when the event hits, depending on the magnitude of the hit, and depending on what you want to measure, if it's just GDP or all the elements of development, to get back to the level that you are measuring. Now, in the case of the GNI, if we start with GNI here, right, and we would have moved from GNI this 20 to 50, the question will be, after the occurrence, how long does it take you to get to your GNI of 50? Now, knowing this as a value in terms of the number of years, so in one case 8 more years, in another case 3 more years, does not help us with the argument of the GNI. What we now need is to convert this number of years in terms of what would it take to move you from this point here to the point up here. What would it take in terms of a value? If we know what that value is, then in principle what we could argue is that it would take you so much effort in terms of GDP to recover from the effects of this event that occurred. And therefore, what we need to be able to argue to the international community is, do not, and you should not, measure me at 10,000 when the event occurs, even if I am at 10,000, because the truth of the matter is, for the next 8 years, my per capita cannot be 10,000. It will be somewhere along that line as I am recovering. Now, why is that important? It's important because the international community, when you hit and your per capita falls by a significant amount, they will still say that your per capita is 10,000 and you have no access to finance. And if you have no access to finance, you have no financial resilience. But if we can say that after the event, your per capita adjusted for the internal resilience capacity is not 10,000 but 3,000, then the measure that ought to be used to determine your access to finance will now be 3,000. That, I think, is a equitable way of saying all countries, depending on their internal resilience capacity, can be measured on the same scale to say whether we give you external access to finance or not should not be based on a raw income per capita, but on a resilience adjusted measure of per capita. So whether you are a small island country with high resilience would mean they need to discount your current per capita by a large amount. And if you are another seed with higher resilience because you are better off, then the amount is going to be less. But it would say that across the divide, we can, in principle, measure this. So this is the concept, show the next chart. This is the concept that we have put across, and that is it in a nutshell. So we said the GNI to access to finance, we've said is not adequate. A shock occurs. When the shock occurs, it's either exogenous or endogenous. Now, endogenous here means we mess up. Okay, we do something stupid, fiscal, we spend money we shouldn't spend. Now, we want to separate it because you don't want the international community to say, you guys are always screwing up, you don't know what you're doing. So let's separate it and pull it aside. But the exogenous ones that we know we have no control over, for example, climate, all right? No control over. When these shocks hit you, you have to be able to manage the fallout. And the fallout will be in three parts. First, what's your vulnerability? Now that is where the vulnerability indices are. They measure small states' vulnerability, okay? Whether you are small size, you have small population, a large part of your population is on the seaside, you are concentrated in your exports, you don't have an ability to do whatever, we say you become a vulnerable state. But in essence, what they're saying is the probability of you being impacted in a material way is defined by a certain measure. Okay? When the shock occurs, that vulnerability becomes an event. And what we need to be concerned about is the magnitude and severity of the event. When we establish the magnitude and severity of the event, we now need to establish, as I showed you in the other chart, the internal resilience capacity, which will depend on your initial conditions, okay? What type of economy you had, what sort of things you had going. It will depend on the magnitude of the event, how big the fall is, and then your ability to transform, in the case of a hurricane, the marginal efficiency of your capital. What type of new investment you can put in, how quickly can it transform, how will you be able to regenerate your production. If you can capture that now for the condition of a duration measure in years, we now need to translate that into the adjuster, which is a dollar value. And we do this through the principle of what we call a compensating variation. In other words, I need to be able to, and that's the trade secret we are keeping now aside. Okay, how do we convert this element here into the numeric value, which is the adjuster? And when you have that adjuster, now you take the original GNI 10,000, big, it will shrink, as they say, small up itself. It will small down to this yellow measure. And if that yellow measure now is 1/2, 1/3 of the bigger measure, now what we want to say is this is what should grant us access to concessional finance. Okay, so that's the idea that we are putting through. The concept is clear. What we need now is to do the magic here in terms of calibration, existing examples of countries that across the world, both Caribbean, Pacific, African, Indian Ocean that can now give us a sense what has happened when recoveries occur. Now, we do know, for example, the last global financial crisis, 2008, SIDS in general, of which we are part, recovered within 1 year in terms of GDP per capita. They recover within a year. On average, our countries in the Caribbean took 4+ years. There are a couple that took 10 years. And there's one or two in particular we won't name that have still not recovered their 2008. Now that is just GDP. We are not talking about the social, the institutional, and the other elements that make up welfare. And so one of the things we are looking at is, although we are in general talking about GNI because we want to focus on access to finance, the general measure you want is not GNI, but economic welfare. Because when the event occurs, your welfare is going to fall by a sizable amount. And you do want recovery of welfare, not recovery of GDP. Okay, so that in principle is where we are. As I said, we are moving into the empirical phase, which will allow us to calibrate and remap the duration measure into a value measure. And we'll call this our one vulnerability and resilience framework, because it's no longer an index. The index, as I said, was in one little part of the bubble. The framework is the bigger picture that we are trying to do, and the application of the framework is the GNI to access to finance, where we are going to propose, or we are proposing, adjusted GNI to access to finance. But it's resilience adjusted GNI as the measure into access to finance. So there you go, that's the, and you could see how the name comes about. It's recovery, but it's recovery duration. Yeah, the duration for your recovery. You could literally think of it in that way, duration of your recovery, and it is an adjuster to GNI to take into account the duration of recovery, recovery duration adjuster in dollar terms. Okay? Yeah. So let's take some questions. Ciao. You maybe need to either use the mic, or is there another mic? Oh, I need to listen?
Yes.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Dr. Leon. This is probably one of the most innovative proposals on vulnerability and measuring vulnerability for SIDS that I've heard here. And this
I hope not here.
well
The entire world.
well so no, but this is great to have the bank, the CDB, propose this as a measure on how to improve access to finance. But in terms of this duration adjuster for a specific event, considering that, you know, with projected climate change, we are going to have events happening faster and more intense, and how is that going to affect the development and the application of the adjuster?
Yeah, all of that is included. Because one of the distinguishing things I talked about was we are moving from the backward-looking measure of an index to a forward-looking dynamic framework. And so once we move beyond the idea of the event is a probability to the event has occurred, the duration itself is not only a function of what you have experienced, it's a function of what you begin to do, when you begin to do it, is there another relapse that occurs in the period, and how does that accumulate to get you back? Remember, what you want is to get back to the point of recovery. And so to the extent that we do know, one, we have repeat events. B, the occurrence of those repeat events are now increasing in intensity, and we can model projections going forward with regard to the occurrence of those events arising out of climate change. All of those will determine, in essence, the duration to get you back. Because as long as there's a probability of it occurring, and that probability increases, the time it will take will therefore have a longer gestation than if you did not have a repeat. So the framework allows you to begin to incorporate future probabilities of how climate is going to evolve. So, and I'm glad you make that point, because the way we characterize it is, whereas a vulnerability index is static, this framework allows you to model the evolution of vulnerability. That's the dynamic part. You can model the evolution. And so it is really only up to a matter of how sophisticated you want to go, how big you want this to be, and the sky really is the limit. Because what we could do is, you can say it is a function of and have a parameter, but that parameter now can be obtained from a whole satellite account in the background, where you could have people working in a very massive way on just the element of climate projections. And that whole climate projection can enter just as one parameter, the increased probability of the next climatic event occurring, and that's all I need to say my duration is going to increase, as long as I have the appropriate measure. So I can do many, many things there in parallel on the side, but the concept of the framework holds and holds well.
Mr. President, very nice meeting you, and thank you for that presentation, very insightful. I hear that the bank, the CDB, has been working on this framework for quite some time, or not? Is it very new? Totally. Okay. 100%. So what has been the... How fast? So
just before you continue, with one caveat.
Okay.
We just were talking about the distinction between the vulnerability index and vulnerability resilience framework. The part that the bank has been working on for many years, over many iterations, is the vulnerability index. What is new is taking it from the vulnerability index and creating the vulnerability resilience framework. Backward to forward looking in a dynamic framework.
excellent, thank you. So that absolutely gives me a lot of context, because I've been following a little bit the back process of this. My question is, how far advanced is the bank in bringing this framework to the international partners like the IMF, the World Bank, and what has been the response of those key partners when the CDB proposes this framework, especially for small island development states?
Well, one, as I said, is brand new. The first rollout of this on the international stage was last week, Thursday, at COP.
And how was it?
And we offered to repeat it here for you. So nobody else, in a sense, has seen it. We have tested the idea at various fora with a few people that we've been talking to in terms of the internal coherence of the logic. Yeah. So the next big target is really, this is clearly for our use, but what we really want is a tool that can be adopted by the international community. So where we are looking to go with this is the UN Committee on Development Policy that meets every 3 years, and they just met February of 2021, when they reiterated that access to concessional finance is going to be based on GNI with a little bit of the HDI, the Human Development Index, and a little bit of vulnerability, but nobody knows exactly what that means. We are hoping that we would have not only developed this, grounded it in empirical evidence, and tested it across the entire UN body so that we could genuinely take to the development policy group by 2024 that we want the world to adopt a new measure of GNI, at least for access to finance. So that's where we are going with this. And the only two criteria we have to keep in mind: if you're going to do this at the UN level, which means 200 countries in the world, it has to be robust and it has to be universally applicable. The robustness of the logic, I don't think we have a problem with. The universality of application is what we have to demonstrate through appropriate empirical methods, that the methodology is sound and the application can be across the board. That's the only way the UN will stand up and take notice. Because that's the only reason why they work with GNI. GNI is a universal metric that can apply to all countries, even if it is imperfect, but it allows you comparability. So you cannot go to them and say it's not good unless you have something that you can replace it with. So that's where we are going. I can't see the IMF or World Bank or any other body for that matter seeing a problem with this. I mean, they have no stake in the game. It is really, can we advance knowledge? Can we advance applicability? Can we make something more equitable, fairer to countries that have issues? And that's what we are trying to do. Because I think, as I explained, there is nothing preventing the US from saying to Dominica in a UN assembly, we have the same vulnerability as you. So how can you come and say to the UN that we Dominicans need more special treatment because we are vulnerable? It has zero universal applicability. The person in Brazil will say, we have vulnerability from fires. For California can say, we have as much vulnerability as you. So you cannot distinguish and make a case for special treatment. And I'm saying, let's not start there. I don't want you to give me special treatment because you will push back. But what if we say that there is a measure of internal resilience capacity? Now, at that point, hands down, I shouldn't have any problem in convincing anybody that Dominica's resilience capacity is much, much less than that of the US, even if they have the same vulnerability. So at that point, I'm playing level playing field. I'm not asking for any special concessions. What I'm asking is to say, let's all agree across the world that what we are going to use is a vulnerability resilience adjusted measure. So the onus then is to show the only way we are different, or the way we differ more, is in terms of our internal resilience capacity. Once we can demonstrate that, there's no argument to raise.
Well, let me tell you congratulations to the CDB for leading the charge and for creating innovation and bringing these solutions for islands.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
I also wanted to congratulate the CDB on a job well done. I was curious to know if you had taken an example for instance, Dominica perhaps, and sort of worked it through to see how the adjustment factor, what it would do to their GNI. And if you're happy, if you have done so, if you're happy with what you're seeing coming out of it.
Yeah, we don't have an absolute measure yet. We are working on this because you have to, as we said, there are a number of factors, initial conditions, and how you measure the duration, the impact, and so on that you need to take into account. What we can say categorically is that you have those two curves. And low resilience is going to be many times more than high resilience. And it is very clear certain countries that are more developed are in the higher resilience category, and those that are in the seeds, highly vulnerable, what we already know, highly vulnerable, are in the low resilience level. But that is our immediate next steps. Is we want to now start looking at, for example, the Dominicas, the Grenada's, the BVI's, the Bahamas, you know, where you have had significant climatic events. We have the economic shocks like the global financial crisis, the current pandemic that we can equally use to calibrate. Take maybe a couple of countries from across the world where similar big events have occurred, and now start to see how you begin to measure and calibrate and finesse so that it becomes, as I said, a tool that is usable not just for 2 Caribbean countries, but across the world. Yep. Shelton? Yeah. Oh, we can't hear you.
All right, apologies for that. Thank you again to everyone for joining us at our... I just want to thank everyone for joining us at the AOSIS Pavilion today. Thank you to Dr. Leon, President of the CDB, for speaking to us today about the adjuster. And since we do have another event, unfortunately we do have to stop, but we can see that it was a very insightful presentation, and we just want to thank the CDB again for hosting it here at our pavilion. Thank you for everyone online for joining.